The world is complex, the Bible is complex. Human existence is a tangled ball of experience, perception, and understanding. Ravel is a puzzling word, denoting both a tangling and untangling. This podcast attempts to hold honest conversations in good faith. Some ideas expressed in this podcast will be challenging. Others will be obvious. When a PhD in biblical interpretation and a habitually podcasting man-child discuss matters of society, scripture, and scandal, you get Ravel.
Hey everybody, you are listening to Ravel, and it's me, your best buddy Basil. And with me, as always, I've got the incisive, the imperturbable, the indefatigable Dr. Christopher Ryan Gates. What's up, buddy?
You definitely just made up words on that one. You just made those
Felt
up.
like it. Certainly felt like it.
Man, all right, well.
But
Can I make requests for introductions on the
No.
next one? Can I write
no,
them out
you
for
can't. It's me. This is all me. And I just do want to point out, Chris, that all words are made up, okay?
Well, I guess that's a point. I guess that is a point.
And heads
It's true.
exploded across the land with Basil's sort of high school stoner piece of wisdom.
Oh,
I'm
boy.
just saying. All right. Well, here we are. Here we are again. How are you doing today?
I'm doing
Okay.
well. Feeling good today.
Good today.
On top of the world. I mean, things just feel really good. So I'm excited. A little bit anxious, actually, as the people will soon find out, because this is going to be. They don't even know what they're in for just yet. But I had to fly solo on this one without you.
Yes, the little baby bird left the nest all on his own, folks. And
It was it's challenging. This is one of the reasons that I appreciate you so much, and I have said it and given you commendation many times in the past about the natural ability that you have to, stay engaged in conversation and move it forward, in a effortless sort of way that feels natural. And I didn't have Basil with me on this one, guys. So if there's a little bit of kind of stammering or whatever, especially right at the beginning, I'm always like, how do you start a conversation with somebody? How do you even start? So, but they'll all find it out. So, but yeah, you were on vacation or something. I don't remember.
I don't remember either.
What were you doing?
I don't remember. Something, probably traveling or something. But, that's the good...
This actually was recorded some time ago now, actually, though, but we're just kind of getting around to getting it out now. You might notice, too, the audio quality not going to be probably what you're used to. It was, one, on my old equipment, and two, didn't get a native file from our guest. Really great guy, though, Matthew Emerson, a theologian. He's up at Oklahoma Baptist University. One of my guys I graduated with is up there now, and he got the two of us connected. So Dr. Emerson is up there. He's the Dean of Theology and Arts and Humanity up there. Yeah, professor of religion, and he's written pretty extensively, and had a book published a couple years ago called He Descended to the Dead, an Evangelical Theology of Holy Saturday, which has gained, some recognition, a couple rewards from some awards. From people.
Such as the 2021 Christianity Today Book Award in Theology and Ethics, Or
Yep.
perhaps the 2019 The Gospel Coalition Book Award in Academic Theology, just to name a couple, Chris.
Those are the ones I was thinking of. Thank you for jogging my memory. So, a good work, and it is, germane to the topic at hand, which is the death of God. And he essentially makes a case for Christ's descent into hell, which is something of a controversial matter. It's a doctrine that the church has held. It shows up originally, I believe, for the first time in the Apostles' Creed, and they talk about him descending into hell after his death, in that time that he's dead and before his resurrection. And you have, First Peter kind of alludes to this in Ephesians chapter 4. There's some allusions to it there too. So there's been a little bit of debate as to whether or not that we should take those passages of Scripture in a literal sense, like the Apostles' Creed does. Some discussion there, but Dr. Emerson comes on and he talks all about that book and his position on it, and it's a really fascinating conversation. Probably would have been more fun with you there, Basil, but
everything's more fun when I'm there, Chris. But you did a wonderful job, okay? I'm telling you right now, folks, Chris, like I said, little birdie left the nest, and he flew high and far, and we're all very proud of you, Chris. So do not
I appreciate it very much.
Do not fret one moment about that. But, as we continue our series on the death of God, I thought this was a really great fit. This is, we talk about the death, we talk about the resurrection of Jesus, we've talked about, philosophical and theological implications of that. I would say that Jesus's descent to the dead or into hell it's a very interesting concept, because it is a little bit secondary to that gospel message. I would not to say that it's completely ignored, and it is a very powerful part of the story. But it's kind of left out of the elevator pitch occasionally. You're doing like the 3-second gospel that Christ died on the cross and resurrected, for the salvation from our sins. It's kind of left out of that 3-second version. And it's very poetically really powerful, the Son of God descending to the place of the dead and roughing it up a little bit. And then returning is in a poetic sense or in a narrative sense very powerful. But I will say, again, I always talk about my lifelong history growing up in the church. Not one that I've heard a lot of super deep, long, detailed sermons about. It's kind of like it's almost like the apex of a gospel sermon. It's like, and then he died on the cross, and with his last breath gave out the cry of dereliction, and then descended into hell. And then it's very somber, and everybody's very impacted by the moment. And then the pastor pauses for some dramatic few seconds, and then suddenly, and he came back and had defeated sin and had the keys to death, and that's the fun and exciting part. And the crowd goes wild. Yeah, but there's not so much time spent, sort of stewing in what that experience may have been like and what the sort of direct theological implications would have been. So this is very fun for me. Yeah. And that's what's most important around here.
Well, if it's fun for you, we assume it's fun for all. So, I think people are gonna enjoy it, though. It's a good conversation, and as you said there, it is not something that we hear too many sermons about, and honestly, not something that we think too deeply about. So we, as I have made promises in the past, when we have occasion, we will find people who have thought deep and long about some of these issues, and even write books about them. So, Dr. Emerson, an authority on this matter. You can take all of these his words pretty well as something close to the gospel truth, but he at least makes a very compelling argument for his side here. So I think everybody's going to really enjoy it. Interesting topic, great conversation. So buckle up.
Okay. Yeah, here we go. Here's the elevator door is opening, everybody. Here, I'll hold it for you. Everybody get on in. This elevator's going down. Ding, ding.
Really excited about today. We are continuing in our series on the death of God. And we have a very special guest with us today, an expert in the field in a certain sense on the death of God, Dr. Matthew Emerson. And he's going to go ahead and tell you guys a little bit about himself, some of his credentials, some of the work he's done, where he works, what he's up to right now before we jump in. So, Dr. Emerson, how you doing? Welcome to the show.
I'm great. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so just really briefly, I'm the Dean of Theology, Arts, and Humanities and Professor of Religion at Oklahoma Baptist University. This is I'm starting my 7th year here. And then I taught at California Baptist University for 4 years before that. I did my master's and doctoral work at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And the reason I think we're talking today is because at the end of 2019, Christmas Eve 2019, I published a book with IVP called He Descended to the Dead, an Evangelical Theology of Holy Saturday. And so just a little bit about what I'm doing right now.
That's some nice light Christmas reading there, it sounds
like. That's right.
So, for the listeners who may not even be kind of abreast at all at what we're talking about, there's a particular doctrine that has been around pretty much through all of church history, kind of all the way back into the Apostles' Creed. And I guess you could say that's where it started. Maybe I can let you give a history of it here for the people, as you know it a little bit better than I do, I'm sure. But basically, in the Apostles' Creed, one of the things that we affirm as evangelicals, it says that Jesus descended into hell during his death, that after his death on the cross and before his resurrection, in that space of time, depending on how you count it, 3 days, we'll just say that he was doing something in those 3 days while his body was laying in the grave. And the Apostles' Creed makes certain claims about what he was doing. And a lot of that, I think, is based on, and you can kind of correct me here, but based on certain texts of Scripture. Psalm 16 kind of talks about it. Ephesians 4, 1 Timothy 3, 1 Peter 3, 1 Peter 4. You kind of have all of these very interesting texts where it talks about Christ descending. He's preaching to these spirits, and there's kind of this really strange thing that nobody quite knows exactly what to do with. So why don't you go ahead and kind of give an introduction to the idea, maybe a little bit of the background, kind of how the doctrine has developed, and kind of just take us into your work and some of the conclusions that you've come to there.
Sure. Yeah, so briefly, in terms of what is affirmed in the descent clause of the creed, so he descended to hell or he descended to the dead, what's being affirmed very simply is that because Jesus is a fully human being, in addition to being fully God the Son in the flesh, because Jesus has a full humanity, he experiences death like every other human does. His body is interred and his soul departs to the place of the dead. And in doing so, by virtue of the hypostatic union, he is victorious over death, so that even in the place of the dead, he can proclaim his upcoming victory in the resurrection, his victory that's already been won at the cross to those in the place of the dead. And when he rises from the dead, it's a fundamental defeat over that place of the dead. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the descent clause. And those three elements, the victory over the place of the dead, the proclamation of victory, and then the fundamental change that happens because of that with the righteous dead. Those three aspects of the descent are found throughout church history, dating as far back as the post-apostolic church fathers. So, and in various forms, and of course, some spelled out more than others, and it gets developed along the way and all that sort of thing. But those three elements are found throughout church history.
So let me pause you right there and jump in and ask you a question, because I know that there are, I can go back to my master's work, and I know that my systematic theology professor, one of them, who I will leave unnamed at this point because he's going to disagree with you, I think, kind of on your conclusion here. But one of the difficulties is that some people will say that descent clause was actually a later addition to the Apostles' Creed. I'm sure you're probably familiar with that kind of controversy there. So what do you make of that, as far as if it had been redacted somewhere along the way? We don't see it in every copy. So how do you reconcile the fact that clause comes in?
Sure.
Perhaps somewhere later.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, number one, I'd encourage your professor to read my book because I deal with all those objections.
I'll let him know.
Yeah, there you go. But number two, there are a few different ways. I mean, the most important way to deal with that objection is simply to demonstrate, and you can demonstrate this, and I do in the book, that for the early church, and by early church, I mean through the early Middle Ages, so essentially through the 7 ecumenical councils, for the early church, the buried clause was understood to be a reference both to really that he died and was buried. That's a reference both to his bodily burial and also his descent in via his human soul to the place of the dead. So you can look at this in, for instance, Rufinus, his comments on the Apostles' Creed, and this is found elsewhere. Just the simple fact that for somebody to die, and this is why I emphasize that Jesus' full humanity in my definition of the descent. For someone to die in the ancient world, that means that your body was buried and your soul departed to the place of the dead. They didn't have to spell that out for people to understand the clause referred to both of those aspects of death, because that's just what death was understood to be: this bodily burial and soulish, however you want to say that, descent. The two really key points in the transmission of the Apostles' Creed where you see this explicit inclusion of the descent clause, and that's not to say it's not in there in other iterations, but there are two moments in the latter 4th century and then again in the mid 7th century. There are these two key moments where you see a proliferation of attestations to the Apostles' Creed where the descent clause is spelled out explicitly. Those two moments are when the church is combating Apollinarianism with vigor. And Apollinarianism is a heresy that says, and this is way too simplistic of a definition, but here's what we're going with.
Yeah, keep it simple for us.
Yeah, Apollinarianism is a heresy that says that Jesus only took on a human body and not a human soul. Well, what better way to combat that particular heresy than to explicitly confess that Jesus descended to the place of the dead, which means that he went by his human soul. So the burial clause, the death and burial clause, was always understood to include both of those aspects: bodily burial, soulful or soulish descent. It's only when Apollinarianism comes along and says, well, Jesus doesn't even have a human soul, that there's this real proliferation of versions of the Apostles' Creed with the descent clause explicitly spelled out. In other words, it's not that the church wasn't confessing it already. It's that they felt like they needed to be even clearer about their confession of it.
Yeah.
Based on
and we see that with some other creeds too, don't we? I mean, kind of I mean, all of them in a sense. They are kind of developed in responses to different heresies. You have even with the Athanasian Creed, towards the end, they have that little the mention of the Holy Spirit, which later has to be further expounded upon as, I mean, I think initially it just gets and the Holy Spirit
Right.
there at the end, and then later they're going to have to go on and say, well, let's explain exactly what we mean about the Holy Spirit, because these creeds, most of the creeds were developed, as you were saying, in responses to heresy, correct?
That's
They're
right.
correcting
That's right.
ideas in the church.
And you think about the same thing with respect to the Nicene Creed and its development between Nicaea in 325 and then at Constantinople in 381. It wasn't, it's an expanded version in 381 that we say today is the Nicene Creed. And the same thing is true of the Apostles' Creed. So there are other clauses in the Apostles' Creed that are found in various places, but they're not as consistently cited as, say, I believe in God the Father Almighty or something like this. So creeds were intended to be teaching tools, and they were intended to be guardrails. And so we know from specific quotations of specific church fathers and other theologians and historians that the burial clause, when it was just the burial clause in the Apostles' Creed, we know in those iterations it also was referencing the doctrine of Christ's descent to the dead. And when it's spelled out explicitly, those are most of the time when the church is attempting to deal with Apollinarianism. So in that context, the teaching and the guardrail becomes even more explicit.
Can't disagree with that. So yeah, we do see kind of and this is one of the things I think that we have to remember is that these early church fathers are they're having to figure out what to do with all of this. We take it kind of for granted because we're here some 2,000 years later, standing on the shoulders of all these guys who have really had to work these things out. But they're all kind of sitting around and really having to flesh out doctrines of, the Trinity and salvation, and really having to parse through kind of the text of Scripture and what it means. There's I'm not sure if you've read Christopher Hall's Learning Theology with the Church Fathers.
I have. Yep.
But
book.
yeah, he talks about the hermeneutical proximity, is what he calls it, of the Church Fathers to the text, and how they are, some of them only a generation or two away from the apostles and kind of developing all of these things. And it kind of, I always tend to say, I mean, if the church fathers said it, they probably, knew what they were talking about. And we tend to think the chronological snobbery, if you will, where the further along we are, we think that these ideas have become more and more developed and we understand it a little better. But you kind of backtrack and you think maybe the ones who were kind of right there in first or secondhand witnesses to these sorts of things might understand it a little better than us. So it's affirmed there in the Apostles' Creed, as you've said, and even though it's kind of a later explanation, we understand that the church kind of understood this all along, maybe just needed a little more description. But let me take you back to, you were mentioning the place of the dead. And we're talking about Christ's descent into hell, and then you had mentioned the righteous dead. That were there too. So this brings up for a lot of people kind of this idea of purgatory or something like that, where there's kind of this like waiting room where perhaps your fate is waiting to be decided, or you have righteous dead and unrighteous dead in this place. So can you give kind of an explanation of where exactly this is, or what it is, or how you understand the place of the dead?
Sure. In the Old Testament, we get texts that speak about a general place of the dead, and a lot of times it's called Sheol. And in those texts, it's a place where everybody goes. So when you die, when a human dies, they go to the place of the dead. And it's described as a place that you don't return from, a place that's dusty and dry, a place that's in some sense, separated from God. Now, I need to be right there to say, I don't believe that the Old Testament describes Sheol in such a way that the righteous dead, and I'll get back to that point in just a second, but I don't believe that the Old Testament describes Sheol in such a way that the righteous dead are totally separated from God. I think what Israel's scriptures are describing is the simple fact that when a person is alive, they're in the midst of the assembly of Israel in the temple or the tabernacle, depending on when the text was written. So they're in the presence of Yahweh, in the house of the Lord, in the middle of the people. When they're dead, they still exist. They're conscious human souls, etc. But they're not inhabiting their physical body, right? They're not in the midst of the assembly. They're not in the house of the Lord. So, these texts, like in the Psalms, where we hear reference to things like you don't remember, or the dead don't remember you, and stuff like this. I think that's actually a liturgical point. That is a point about Israel's worship. Well, of course, the dead don't remember you, because remembering Yahweh is something you do in the temple. Now, that doesn't mean they don't consciously know about Yahweh, or that they're not present with him in some sense, but they're not present with him through the temple worship. So, I think the Old Testament describes all the dead going to this certain place, the place of the dead, and that place is described as a prison. It's described as dry and dusty. Sometimes, though, it's described as underneath the sea, to the west, beyond the sea. In any case, it's somewhere that's inaccessible to the living, and it's somewhere that is the stronghold of the enemy, and it's somewhere that we can't get out of on our own. Then as you progress through the Old Testament, and especially in the prophets, and especially in a place like Daniel, you get more and more indications that, yes, everyone goes to the place of the dead, but that place is, it has, for lack of a better term, compartments to it. So these aren't physical boxes or anything like that, but the dead are essentially separated. There's a place for the righteous dead, a place for the unrighteous dead. It's the same place, it's the place of the dead, but you get this distinction between how the righteous experience that place and the unrighteous experience it. And righteousness is based on faith in Yahweh, faith in God. And then when we get into the New Testament, and there's some background literature we could talk about, but just to stick with the biblical literature, when you get to the New Testament, the best example is Luke 16. So you have Jesus.
I was going to ask,
Yeah, you have this parable that Jesus tells of Lazarus and the rich man. Lazarus is a beggar. He's sick. He begs every day for this rich man to give him money, food, etc. And the rich man ignores him. Dogs lick Lazarus's wounds, all this sort of thing. They both die. Lazarus ends up in a place that's referred to there as Abraham's bosom, and the rich man ends up in Hades. And in the Bible and Second Temple literature, that is Jewish literature from this time period, Abraham's bosom was also known as paradise, and Hades was also known as Gehenna or Sheol in a very negative sense. And so you have this distinction between both of them are in the place of the dead, but there's this distinction. There's a chasm, Jesus says, that they can't cross. The rich man asked for a drop of water, and there's all sorts of talking that happens. They're in the same place, but they can't cross the boundary between Hades and Abraham's bosom or paradise. And so what we're saying when we talk about the righteous place of the dead or compartments or so on and so forth, it isn't purgatory. In modern language, it's the same thing that we would say as something like, well, this person believed in Jesus when they died, so they're in heaven right now, and this person doesn't believe in Jesus, and therefore when they die, they're in hell. And then in the last judgment, when Jesus comes back, those who are in heaven experience eternal life on the new heavens and new earth. Those who are in hell experience eternal torment in the lake of fire. So paradise is a synonym for heaven. Hades is a synonym for hell. Both of them are waiting on that final judgment to come, where their current fate is heightened and matched in their eternal fate. And that's what we're talking about when we say righteous realm, unrighteous realm, compartments, that sort of thing.
That's a very great explanation of that. So when we're talking, then bringing it back to the topic at hand, when we're talking about Christ's descent, is this the type of place that you're talking about? Would it be that Hades there in opposition to Abraham's bosom that we're talking about Jesus going to? And let me just, for the listeners, I think that probably you may, I think the Ephesians text a lot of people will usually go to, but maybe even more than that is the First Peter text in chapter 3. And I have it right here in verse, 18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. So when it's talking about imprisoned spirits, now you had mentioned that imprisonment might just be the state of death that kind of nobody can escape from. But can you kind of parse this text a little bit for us in relation to the explanation of the afterlife that you just gave us?
Yeah, so in 1 Peter 3, I actually think that reference to the spirits in prison is probably referring to evil angels.
Oh,
yeah, and so
all right,
and so,
I like it.
I tried to. I mean, I wasn't brief, but I attempted to sort of give the broad overview. But the other piece to the ancient view of the underworld was that on the lowest level, or the lowest compartment, to use that same language we've been using, if the righteous dead are in the upper compartment and the unrighteous dead are in the next one, the lowest compartment was reserved for evil angels, and that was referred to as a prison, or Tartarus.
Uh-huh.
And
is this like a Dante's Inferno sort of thing going on here? Do we have levels?
Yeah, I think that Dante is drawing on some of this as he describes the Inferno, but it's much more. Dante is, I would say, literarily riffing off of this kind of ancient cosmology in a way that's not specified in the biblical text.
Yeah.
In order to make moral and philosophical points.
I like that.
But there certainly are tiers in ancient cosmology related to how the underworld is mapped out, basically.
Oh man, I'm just fighting the urge to just jump into talking about hell altogether because it's a current fascination of mine. But I tend to believe people think that hell is just one huge big lake of fire where the experience for everyone is the same, and I don't think that that's necessarily true.
Right. Well, it is interesting that Jesus does say he does make some statements about
it being worse for some people than others.
Worse for some people than others.
Yeah.
And also about to whom much is given, much is required, this sort of language. So I wouldn't rule out gradations in judgment, as long as we realize that at a fundamental level, the overarching judgment is the wrath of God.
Yeah. Any of it's really bad, but there's some that's more really bad.
yeah, that's right.
But I think when you look at it, we have pretty clear indication too, I think in heaven, that there are rewards that kind of match your performance here on earth, if you want to put it in such simple terms. But I think the punishment kind of fits the crime. I think that kind of it makes me feel a little bit better about hell. I mean, I hate hell. I hate thinking about it. I hate talking about it. It's not very comfortable. But when you think about the fact that Hitler may not be experiencing the same type of hell as, your sweet aunt who did everything wonderfully in her life and maybe just never gave her life to the Lord, but was a really sweet person, that maybe they're not having the same experience in hell. It at least kind of helps me sleep a little bit better at night. But that's a whole nother conversation, and we only have so much time today. So bring us back to, we were getting all the way down to Tartarus and to the imprisoned spirits, and we actually are going to have a lot of crossover here with some people who will be really familiar with Dr. Mike Heiser's work. I'm not sure if you're familiar with
Yep.
his work at all. Yeah, but he actually has a pretty interesting take on Christ's descent and those sorts of things. But I think there's a lot of people who, when you say, kind of the fallen angels or whatever, they're already tracking with you, going back to Old Testament divine counsel sorts of things, and kind of understanding where you're going, especially this being tied into the days of Noah and all that. So
Sure.
take us back to Tartarus and the imprisoned spirits.
Yeah, so if you think about the place of the dead as being inhabited by three distinct groups of soulish beings, the righteous dead, the unrighteous dead, both of which are human beings, and then Tartarus, evil angels. Essentially, what I argue that 1 Peter 3 is describing is Jesus, after his crucifixion and prior to his resurrection, being in that same place in the righteous compartment, because he says to the thief on the cross, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." He's the only truly righteous person on earth, et cetera. So in the righteous compartment. But because that righteous compartment is part of the one place of the dead, he can proclaim his victory to everyone. Just like the rich man and Lazarus, it's really the rich man and Abraham talk to each other across the chasm in Luke 16. I think Jesus can proclaim his victory that he's already won at the cross, and he's going to demonstrate in his resurrection to all of the dead, and to all those in the place of the dead, including righteous and unrighteous human dead, and including those evil angels in Tartarus. So I think that's what's happening in 1 Peter 3, and that's that proclamation aspect of the descent clause.
So let me ask you, because I've heard it asked, and I even kind of struggle with this a little bit myself, but what is the purpose here? Why is Jesus going? Is this just kind of like, is he showing off? If these people are there, there's no chance at redemption for any of them. So is it just kind of rubbing salt in the wound here, or what is who can know the mind of God, but
right.
what is the purpose of Jesus going down and proclaiming his victory to these imprisoned spirits?
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons. So first of all, he is proclaiming his victory to those who have been waiting for him. So he's telling the righteous dead what you have been waiting for. And, with respect to, Adam and Eve, they've been waiting a really long time. He's saying to them, hey, listen, what you've hoped for by faith is now sight, and will be even further sight tomorrow when I rise from the dead. So that's one piece of it. I think that into darkness there has shone a great light, to quote Isaiah. Another reason that I think that he does this, that he descends to this particular place, and this doesn't necessarily have to do with the proclamation aspect, but I do think it's important to talk about with respect to the descent, is just solidarity with humans. He's a fully human being, and he experiences everything that humans do, except for sin, including the penalty of sin, which is death. So I think there's an aspect of solidarity to the descent in terms of explaining why he does this. But in terms of this proclamation being given both to the righteous dead, but also to the unrighteous dead and to the evil angels, one aspect of redemption is judgment. So God's judgment is actually part of his redemption of the world, because he's judging what is unholy, what shouldn't be here, what needs to be cast out. And his descent is proclaiming his victory to those who have been cast out by virtue of their own decisions, both evil angels and human beings. And they will be cast out when he comes back, when they're cast into the lake of fire. But they're already proleptically cast out, or sort of looking forward to being fully cast out here in this unrighteous compartment in the prison for evil angels in the place of the dead. So proclamation to and victory over the unrighteous is actually an important part of redemption. And then the other thing I would say, so you've got this solidarity piece, you've got victory, you've got proclamation. It's interesting you brought up Heiser, though, because I think Heiser kind of punts at the very end of his book, because the Descent is like the perfect place to end his whole argument. His whole argument is that the story of Israel is the story of the conflict between the seed of woman and the serpent, and this victory that Jesus wins is over the serpent. The place of the dead is the kingdom of Satan. And so that, this is kind of the perfect doctrine for Heiser to really hammer home his point theologically, to say, look, the seed of woman actually goes into the stronghold of the serpent and binds the strong man there and emerges victorious, tearing the whole house down like Samson. But he stops short. The same thing is true of
well,
Matthew.
let me jump in right there, and I'll let you get back to it, because we're hoping to get Dr. Heiser on mic if you're listening.
Which I say that in the book, by the way. I rely on Heiser, and then I make that particular point in the book. So this isn't something I haven't said before. So
yeah. Well,
FYI.
he may have heard it, because he actually has here recently kind of answered that question to a certain extent, and he does kind of go there in his podcast, and I think it's in a Q&A that he does. But I was actually kind of listening to it in preparation for talking with you. But he talks about baptism essentially as a continual sort of reminder to the enemy, where you're taking a believer and you're symbolically, as we see in Romans, lowering them down beneath the water, down into the realm of the dead, almost showing that person, in a sense, to the enemy. And then as you're bringing them back up out of the water, it's almost a taunt, saying, you don't get this one. And then you raise them into new life. And I think that's a kind of a fair summation of what he was saying. He may be able to come on, obviously, and explain it a little better than I do. But I think he does eventually get there, even if he didn't publish that in his book. But
sure,
I think that you raise a really good point there, that in this kind of cosmic struggle that has been going on since the inception of the world, it really is that is the final nail in the coffin, I guess, if you will, for death, was Jesus' resurrection. And it's one of the important things. And I don't know how your work kind of illumines the resurrection. I don't know if there's a different lens in which you look through the resurrection, having this kind of intimate knowledge about Christ's descent. But we talk a lot about Jesus' death, and even as we're going through this series right now, we're talking about the death of God. But the death of God, while it is huge, and who can wrap their mind around the whole thing, is nothing without the resurrection. I actually wrote my dissertation on the cry of dereliction, and kind of some of the implications that can be drawn from that, and the forsakenness of Jesus. And we won't get into all of it right now, but how does your work kind of what is the hope for believers? What is the practicality of it for, just the person who's going about their day-to-day life, who may be listening to this, and how does it kind of give new light to the resurrection?
Sure. So in terms of the resurrection and then how the descent sort of sheds new light on that, or those sorts of things, I'm not sure that it sheds new light on anything, but I do think that when we think about the resurrection, we often think about it almost exclusively in kind of validation terms. So the resurrection is the rubber stamp on Jesus's atoning death, which it certainly is. It does show that his sacrifice was accepted by God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there are a number of other things that we can say about it, and I think some of those things are put in particular relief by the descent. One of those is that Jesus is king, so his resurrection is a sign of his kingship, and he's king over everything. He's king over all of reality, including the stronghold of his enemy. He's king over even death itself. That's where he rules. Every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth at the name of Jesus. So this kingship aspect is important, and I think the descent brings that into relief because he goes down into that kingdom and emerges victorious from it. The gates of hell will not prevail because Jesus has gone into hell and knocked the gates down. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is pastoral, and I try to emphasize this a lot in the book, that the descent reminds us that Jesus has gone before us into the valley of the shadow of death, and that because he has already experienced death with us and therefore for us, we can face death, either our own or that of a loved one, with confidence, not without mourning or sadness, but with confidence that Jesus has gone before us and is with us and will bring us to the other side of that river. So I think it's a really pastoral doctrine, actually, that there is the hope of the resurrection on the last day, but even in the meantime, Jesus has already experienced what we or our loved ones are about to experience in death.
Yeah, let me. That is good. I don't want to just kind of gloss over that, but I do want to keep moving along and get your opinion on a couple other things here. But that is, to think that Jesus has experienced all of those. The same, there's no human experience. I often in my own life kind of think, well, I mean, Jesus, how could he ever have experienced this, what I'm going through? And you can fill in the blank, and I think we all have kind of been there. But I find the more and more that I study and the more I learn and the more I come to know the Lord, that he shares his heart with me, that it's kind of like I'm continually catching up with him. He's like, no, I've already been there. Welcome. Yes, this is what it's like. This is what it's like to have that experience. And he can kind of walk you through that even to death. But you had talked about basically him, taking on the substitutionary atonement, him taking on the punishment for sin that believers ought to experience. So that's a whole nother kind of can of worms to open there in and of itself. But so depending on how you want to look at it, the punishment for sin is hell. It is suffering in hell, right? So if you're not saved, if you don't place your faith in Jesus and you take the weight of your own sin onto yourself, then the punishment for that is eternal torment in a place reserved for those, called hell. So there are some people who kind of, when they think about Christ's descent into hell too, and I've heard it mentioned that it's that Jesus was actually experiencing that. He was experiencing the punishment for sin. And there will be people who will try to argue it and say, well, he had to experience that punishment in order that we don't. That's precisely what it is. If he didn't take on the punishment for our sins, and how can we be absolved from it, and that whole thing. So how do you answer a question like that when it says that he descended? And I mean, of course, you have the text of Scripture, which doesn't say he descended into hell and was tormented and, weeping and gnashing his teeth and all of that. But there's that idea that comes in, I think, a lot of times with this. So when you're talking about death being the punishment for sin and all of those different things, but then we also have the wrath of God, how do you answer the question as to how was it that Jesus took on our punishment in the cross, and then what does that mean for the descent?
Yeah, so I don't think that Jesus took punishment in the descent. I think that happened on the cross. So Jesus substitutes himself for sinners. He takes the wrath that we owe, that we deserve. He receives the punishment that we should be receiving on the cross. And so I affirm penal substitution wholeheartedly, without reservation, etc. But I don't think that penal substitution is what happens in the descent. I think it's what happened at the cross. And so the descent clause is, Jesus has already said it is finished, and it really has been finished. He's done. He's paid the penalty for sin, and now he's proclaiming victory. Now, again, in terms of paying the penalty for sin, that includes, and I was just reading something, Augustine in the Trinity book 5, I think, talks about all the different it's either 4 or 5, all the different facets of the atonement. And he actually says that Jesus had to experience death, or experience the punishment for sin in 2 ways: physical death and experiencing the wrath of God, essentially in his soul. And so he says, that he experiences the wrath of God on the cross, and then he dies and experiences bodily death as well. Both of those are the punishment for sin. So in one sense, Jesus descending to the dead is continuing to experience the punishment for sin, but it's simply still being dead. He died, he's still dead. Yeah. In the other sense, which is the sort of soulful sense, he's already done that. He doesn't need to keep doing it. He's experienced, he's taken on the wrath of God on himself at the cross. And so there's no reason for that to continue in his descent, because he's already done it. And the Bible, most importantly here is the Bible. And I don't believe the Bible talks about Jesus experiencing torment after his crucifixion in death. I don't believe the Bible talks about Jesus descending to Hades, to hell, to Gehenna, however you want to say that. I believe the Bible talks about Jesus descending to the place of the dead, to the righteous compartment, in order to proclaim his victorious death that he's just undergone, in order to experience death in solidarity with us, in order to do all the things we already talked about. But I don't believe it talks about Jesus being in the place of torment prior to his resurrection. So most importantly is the Bible in this conversation. Yeah. But you also have just the fact that would do a bunch of different stuff in funky ways to Christology. It would mess with the doctrine of the Trinity in certain ways, and I go into all this in the book. But I don't think it's feasible, either from the Bible or from systematic theology, to say that Jesus was tormented on Saturday.
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad to hear you say that. I didn't think you would say anything else, but yeah, it is something that I have heard brought up, and I figured perhaps a lot of people out there listening might be wondering too, when they just hear about the idea of Jesus going to hell. What was he doing there? But it kind of gives me, the way you're explaining it, sort of that picture of the that triumphal procession where the conquering king kind of comes in, to the kingdom with his captives behind him. I think, is it Colossians? I'm trying to think of where that is, but
it's Ephesians 4. Yeah,
Ephesians 4. Thank you. Colossians, I'm thinking of glorying over the enemies in the cross. Right. That's the one. Right. But yeah, the triumphal procession, is that sort of how we should be understanding this, with him going in and proclaiming kind of his victory over death?
Yeah, I think that's exactly how we should think about it. That he's demonstrating, he's declaring his victory over this kingdom of the enemy. And that's what's happening in his descent.
And when you say kingdom, that's another thing that we have I think people have these misconceptions all the time about hell, that it's like you think about hell and it's like Satan's like the Lord there, right? And he's
Right.
ruling over it, and he's actually kind of having a good time tormenting all these people and
Right.
poking them with his pitchfork. And when you say kingdom, I don't want anybody to have the idea that you're talking about it as being a place where Satan's in charge, because I
Right.
believe, I don't think you would disagree with me, perhaps you may, but I believe that God is even in charge of hell, that he presides over. It's in Revelation, I think, 14. It's talking about those who have taken the mark, and it says they're tormented in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And this does a lot of really interesting things for my theology when I start thinking about hell, because it's like, wait a second, the people being tormented in hell, that is in the presence of
Right.
Jesus, because we're always told that hell is the place where Jesus' presence doesn't exist. So
Right.
when you talk about
God is
kingdom,
fully present. God is fully present everywhere. So
even in hell.
even in hell,
Wow, you're blowing people's minds right now, I bet.
the distinction is not between God being present and not present, but between different kinds of creatures, righteous and unrighteous. So he's fully present everywhere. And,
I love this. I love this.
I would just say yes. Of course, Jesus is still. I mean, God Himself is ruling and reigning over even hell. The distinction is that he gives temporary authority and in certain ways to various figures.
Sure.
This is true in government. In governments, it's true here in hell. In one sense, you have Satan is the prince of the power of the air, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so he is in one sense the ruler over this realm, but in another sense, he's not at all, because he's subject to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It's same thing with like the story in Job, where the accuser comes and says, I want to basically destroy Job's life.
Right.
And
right.
God gives him the permission to do that.
He sets the parameters.
Right. That's right. So same thing with hell. Whether we're talking about the temporary holding place, or we're talking about the lake of fire, same thing. And even with the lake of fire, there's a change there. Satan is no longer in charge of anything. He's just cast in, just like everybody else. So, he's not in charge in any real way, other than he's been set over it temporarily.
Well, let me ask you too, and I know we're running out of time here, but because you brought up the gates of hell, and I've heard so many different takes on the gates of hell and what that means, and of course Jesus, most people, making their speculations about that when Jesus is talking to Peter and talks about essentially, he will build his church on this rock, Peter, the rock, but the rock of, his profession of faith. And he says, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So how do you understand and kind of parse that text? What is it? Because I've heard many different takes on it, on what that means, the gates of hell not prevailing. But how do you understand that?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I haven't, it's not my area of expertise, et cetera, all those qualifications. I think that the gates of hell are the gates of the place of the dead. And I think the reason why Jesus says that the gates of hell won't prevail is because he is the resurrection and the life. So they've already been kicked down and destroyed by him. Or when he says that, he hasn't done it yet, but now after the fact, we know he has. So he's already done it. It's done. He's destroyed the gates. And of course, that doesn't mean that people. It doesn't mean that people don't go to hell anymore, or that eternal torment isn't a thing anymore. It means that he has defeated death and is in charge of death itself. and therefore in charge of judgment and all the rest. He holds the keys. And so because he holds the keys, he can give the keys to the church, and also he can say that these gates won't prevail because he's in charge. He's the only one who can let anybody out. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think it's primarily about episcopal authority as much as it's about Jesus's authority.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of really what I was getting at and asking you, because there is this sort of this sort of idea that there's, this, I don't know, kind of this sort of spiritual warfare that the church is storming, the gates of hell on the authority of Jesus. And I don't want to, discount anybody's interpretation of that or say that that's wrong or say that, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. But I think that the way that you said it too is kind of the way that I've kind of come to understand it as I've read on it, is that it is, the gates of hell. You go back into the Old Testament and you're given this picture that it is death that is being talked about. It really is. He's talking about death, and that death no longer, holds sway over any of us. And like you said, some of us will die spiritually, and some of us will experience hell for all of eternity, but no one has to anymore. That is not, well, right. I guess nobody really ever had to ever, really, because even you go back to salvation has been offered even to Adam and Eve from the very beginning. But kind of weird how eternity works and being in this temporal timeline with all of these things.
Yep.
But yeah, that is kind of how I've kind of come to understand that too. Oh man, there's so many other things that I want to talk to you about, but it is we're coming up almost on an hour here already. So is there anything else that you want to kind of address? Is there anything kind of just like on your heart that you wish we got to, or anything where I cut you off and you were trying to get back to it?
No, I think that it's important for me to repeat that I believe in this doctrine because I believe the Bible teaches it. It's not just because the early church confessed it or because it's in a creed. I believe the Bible teaches it. And we haven't talked a whole lot about biblical data, but I spend a lot of time in the book talking about that. So for some listeners, and I really understand why, for some listeners, they're going to be going, wait a minute. Okay, it's in the Apostles' Creed, whatever. What about the Bible? I understand the impulse. So just want to emphasize that I believe in this doctrine ultimately because I believe it's biblical. The other thing I would say in terms of things to consider is a guy named Matthew Thiessen, and I think it's Thiessen, not Thiessen, maybe it's the other way, but just published a book last year, I think, called Jesus and the Forces of Death. And this is another place where I wish that the author had gone just a little bit further. Because his book argues that in the miracles that Jesus does related to the cleanliness laws in the Old Testament, so when he heals, for instance, the woman with the issue of blood, that Jesus isn't ignoring or downplaying the Levitical law, but is instead affirming it and fulfilling it. And his argument is that, he can do this, he can heal this woman, not because he's ignoring the cleanliness laws, but because the cleanliness laws are intended to consecrate things, people, places, and therefore, to allow people to approach the divine. Well, when Jesus heals this woman, it's an encounter, a physical encounter with holiness himself, holiness in the flesh.
Yeah.
And so when death comes into contact with life, it's defeated. It's gone. And man, I was just like, come on, say something about the descent. Jesus goes into the place of the dead, but he doesn't say anything about it. And I don't, it's a biblical studies book. It's not a theology book. So I think that may have something to do with it. But That's another just example of how the dissent connects with current scholarship, with themes in biblical studies, these sorts of things. And I think it's an important doctrine that's been neglected, and I hope it sees some renaissance, or however you say that.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that's really good, man. I'm thinking about that. It reminded me of my professor, Dr. Bill Warren there at NOBTS, and we were in a Mark seminar, and he was talking about, Jesus healing the leper, and how in Old Testament law it was always if a clean person, a clean quote unquote person came in contact with an unclean person or an unclean thing, the clean person then became unclean as well. And he said it's not until Jesus that the clean thing, that being Jesus, comes in contact with the unclean thing, that being the leper, and the unclean thing then becomes clean. And I just thought how profound that was, and how that was something that I never really had thought of. But yeah, I can see how all of that can tie into your work. It's really funny how us in the academic community, we can kind of tie everything into our particular area of expertise. I find everything coming back to.
That's right.
Yeah, it is. Well, I sure do appreciate your time. This has really been fascinating. Why don't you go ahead? I know that you had mentioned as we were talking here before we got on that you have your own podcast. You have a couple other books, not just the one that you recently published here, but tell people how they can follow your work, how they can get a hold of what you've done, where they can get your book. I'm sure there's going to be some people interested in it after all of this talk, but go ahead and plug some of that stuff.
Yeah, so the thing that I do regularly is run, along with 3 other guys, something called the Center for Baptist Renewal. And you can find us at twitter.com/Baptist Renewal, facebook.com/Baptist Renewal, and centerforbaptistrenewal.com. And, we haven't talked, I think you're Baptist. Am I right? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm a closet Baptist. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, sorry to bring that out in the light. But, one of the things that I want to do is connect Baptists with the history of Christianity, essentially. And of course, this dissent book is a piece of that.
Sure.
Connecting us to a particular doctrine. But there are other ways that I try to connect. We try to connect Baptists to the broader Christian tradition. And so the podcast that I mentioned earlier is our Center for Baptist Renewal podcast. It's on YouTube and podcast things. I don't even know what they're called. I just talk. And so I think wherever
it's a channel,
wherever you can listen to podcasts, I'm pretty sure you can find it. And so that's a big part of what I try to do.
But if you're not a Baptist, can you still listen to it?
Absolutely. In fact, we're having a 2021 reading challenge right now where we're encouraging people to read ancient works. And so I think at this point
very cool.
We're up to Aquinas, but we started with Irenaeus, and we're just kind of making our way
very nice
through church history. So
you're not gonna ask people to read Augustine, are you?
Oh yeah.
You had mentioned the Trinity. I had to read that for one of my. Oh my goodness! What a beast that was.
Right. Well,
I don't know if Augustine even really knows what he's saying sometimes. Honestly,
he's one of the greats, and I think maybe the 3rd or 4th book we read was his Enchiridion. So it wasn't the Trinity, which is a beast of a book.
I'm sure your books, though, are much easier to handle. Where can we get a hold of those?
Amazon.
Anywhere fine books are sold?
That's right. Amazon, which, whatever you think about Amazon.
Necessary evil.
Yep. Amazon and IVP Academic is where my dissent book was published. So if you want to buy directly from the publisher, there who published that. We have a book on Baptists in the Christian tradition with B&H, which is Amazon, but also B&H Academic. So, and then there's a few others, but I won't get into all that.
All right. Well, we have kind of an ecumenical audience here. So if any of you do not hail from a Baptist background, which I do, I was brought up in a Baptist church. I attended a Baptist seminary. I am Baptist through and through, but it just carries a lot of baggage sometimes. So don't be scared of the baggage that comes along with Baptists. We're not all stuffy and, terrible to get along with. Some of us are really wonderful people. So, if you're out there.
At least me and you are.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I can only
if nobody else.
But yeah, if you're out there, you find any of this stuff interesting, be sure to check out some of his work. And Dr. Emerson, thank you so much for taking your valuable time to be here with us and talk about this. It was really, really interesting. And perhaps, I don't know, we'll see about maybe getting you back on again sometime in the future. But thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Ravel. To learn more about who we are, what we believe, or how to support this ministry, visit our website at ravelpodcast.com. If you have a question you would like answered on the show, or to let us know how we're doing, email us at contact@ravelpodcast.com. This project is made possible by the prayers and generosity of listeners just like you.
Going with more of an implied thing just to not trigger grandma.